Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of the Friday seminar. I am very pleased to introduce Regan Patterson. Regan is a newly appointed assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering at UCLA. Her research focuses on the intersection of sustainable transportation, air quality, and environmental justice. She uses air quality models to quantify traffic-related air pollutant emissions and concentrations in urban disenfranchised communities. Dr. Patterson was previously the Transportation Equity Research Fellow for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, where she conducted intersectional transportation policy analysis and research. And prior to joining the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, she was a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Michigan Institute for Social Research. And she earned her PhD in environmental engineering at UC Berkeley. So take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Is it okay if I sit? Yeah. Okay.
Let me go ahead and mic her.
Okay.
Just to make sure that everyone online can hear.
Okay.
Am I speaking softly? That's like a first. So, hello again. Ooh, this is so official now. Okay. So, I am very honored to be here to speak with you all as part of the seminar series. As mentioned, my name is Dr. Regan Patterson, and I am a recently appointed assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering. And so, as mentioned, my research focuses on that intersection of air quality engineering, sustainable transportation, and environmental justice. And so, more specifically, I examine and I model the impact of transportation policies and place-based, community-driven interventions on pollution exposure disparities and environmental justice. And so, also as mentioned, very good bio intro. My research agenda is informed by my previous experience at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation in Washington, D.C., and it's also inspired by grassroots organizing. And that will become very clear throughout my presentation today. And so with that, the title of my talk is Freeway Removal, Lessons from the Past to Inform an Equitable Transport Future. And so this image is of the Cypress Freeway following the Loma Prieta earthquake, which I will discuss shortly. Okay. So while I received academic training in engineering, I always like to say that I came to truly understand the human consequence of transportation-related policies and practices through the work of specifically Black women environmental justice organizers, specifically in the Bay Area, who are fighting for and reimagining a world conducive to livable Black futures. And so the US EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. But as Dr. Bullard, I'm not sure if some of you are familiar with him or not, he is considered the father of environmental justice. And he reminds us that environmental justice was born out of grassroots organizing. So though we frequently quote this EPA definition, it's really born out of grassroots organizing. And so in fact, before there was the phrase environmental justice, Dr. Chavis of the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice coined the term environmental racism. And so this is a much less palatable for dominant structures term, which he defines as, quote, racial discrimination in environmental policymaking and enforcement of regulations and laws, the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, the official sanctioning of the presence of life-threatening poisons and pollutants in communities of color, and the history of excluding people of color from leadership of the environmental movement. And so I name this because for us to pursue justice, we must first name and address harm. And so a requisite for justice is the reduction and elimination of harm. And this will become important later. So with that, to move toward a just and equitable future, I think it's very important that we understand our history, where we've been, and how we got here in order to address these legacy issues. And so I'll start with going back to the Federal Aid Highway Act, when freeway construction and urban renewal inequitably impacted poor communities of color, predominantly Black communities, and freeway construction resulted in the displacement, the division, the demolition of neighborhoods, as well as entire local economies. And so this is an image of the Chrysler Freeway in Detroit, which paved over 2 Black neighborhoods, Paradise Valley and Black Bottom. And so here we can see an example of that destruction. You can see, is this a little lady? Oh, yeah. So you can see in both images, and so you can see the extent of destruction. Hastings Street, which you see on the left, had over 300 businesses, all of which were destroyed for this freeway. These are images of Atlanta from the same place. These are images of Minneapolis, provided by Segregation by Design. I'm not sure if anyone here is following that account, but it's a great Instagram account because they're going city by city to really look at the impacts of freeways. And so really these images are showing that this happened all across the nation. And so what are the consequences of freeway investments? So freeway investments, along with discriminatory housing and lending policies, include an automobile-dominated transportation system, restricted mobility, stolen wealth and concentrated poverty, a heightened risk of pedestrian injuries, and increased air and noise pollution. And so freeway placement really promoted segregation, physically isolating communities of color in polluted environments. Then you add that with discriminatory planning practices such as redlining, racially restrictive covenants, and exclusionary zoning, which prevented movement to other areas. And so due to these practices, for instance, Black folks are more likely to live near major roadways. In fact, almost 1/4 of African Americans in the US live near highly trafficked roads. And so this contributes to racial ethnic disparities and exposure to traffic-related air pollution. And so this image is from a recent study that found nitrogen dioxide disparities across 52 cities. For the upper left is for Black population, B, Latinx communities, then Asian and Indigenous peoples compared to non-Hispanic whites. And the study found when looking at low-income people of color compared to high-income non-Hispanic whites, there is a disparity of 28%, where low-income people of color are exposed to 28% higher NO2. And another recent study found that people of color experience a 14% disparity in fine particulate exposure. And so light-duty gasoline and heavy-duty diesel vehicles, which are indicated by the green boxes, are among the largest sources of racial ethnic disparity and exposure to fine particulate matter. As you see, there's many sources, but we see this contribution to disparity from the vehicles. And so disproportionate exposures contribute to disparate health impacts. So we see things like racial ethnic disparities in asthma, preterm birth, cancer risk, and mortality. So given these adverse impacts, there has been substantial grassroots organizing against freeway infrastructure since the Federal Aid Highway Act. And so now I'll go into the case data study of the Cypress Freeway. And so these 3 images show the demolition of West Oakland to build the Cypress Freeway. And West Oakland was a red line neighborhood and one of the very few East Bay neighborhoods where Black folks could own homes. Construction of the Cypress Freeway led to property demolitions and displaced 600 families. And then this was completed in 1958 and bisected West Oakland. But then, if folks are familiar with the Bay, is anyone here from the Bay? What kind of folks from the Bay will know West Oakland is surrounded by 2 additional freeways, as well as other urban renewal projects, including the big post office distribution center that you may be familiar with. And so together that destroyed 5,000 housing units and resulted in economic decline in the area. So when the Cypress Freeway collapsed, but when the Cypress Freeway collapsed during the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, the California Department of Transportation favored a rebuild option on the same alignment. However, unlike during urban renewal, there was now the National Environmental Policy Act, which provided the community with the opportunity to participate in the decision-making process. And so for Caltrans, it was simply about replacing this critical freeway infrastructure link. But for community, this was actually an opportunity to redress environmental injustice. And so we see what freeways mean to different entities, to different stakeholders, right? And so community leaders and activists organized the Citizens Emergency Relief Team, or CERT, to oppose reconstruction along the original route. And interestingly, among its members were Bill Love, whose mother actually led the fight against urban renewal and saved homes in West Oakland. So to still see those old homes in West Oakland, that took a fight because those were all going to be gone. As well as Paul Cobb, whose grandfather's home and grocery store were demolished for bark. So until recently, I'm not sure if folks know how West Oakland was considered a food desert because it didn't have a grocery store. Pre-freeways, there were grocery stores. After freeways, there's no more grocery stores. And so Love's mother and Cobb's father had lost the fight against the Cypress and the Grove Shafter, commonly known as the 980, which will be discussed later. So when the Cypress fell, Sir identified an alternative route around the perimeter, which we see here, in an industrial area, so less exposure. And so in 1991, Caltrans actually selected the new alignment. However, it did now impact residents in the lower bottoms, which is here. So somebody is always getting the short end of the stick. And so residents filed a discrimination suit under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This case was settled out of court and brought in the mitigation measures to include the transformation of the former freeway into the landscape boulevard. And so I share this long story because I think it's really important to reinsert people into our work. So often we hear about these projects, we hear about the impact, about construction, but really centering the people who are part of these movements. And so freeway removal or rerouting projects often involve building a street level landscaped boulevard in the former corridor. And so transforming the former alignment into a landscape boulevard increases green space, which is great. However, a consequence of that expanded green space is what Walsh, who is at UC Berkeley, defines as the green space paradox. And so that is that while the creation of new green space to address environmental justice problems can make neighborhoods healthier and more aesthetically attractive, it can also increase housing costs and property values, leading to gentrification and displacement of the very residents the green space strategies were designed to benefit. And so this paradoxical situation has been termed environmental gentrification. Some folks term it climate gentrification, green gentrification, very similar processes indicated in this figure on the right, where you have this environmental justice activism that leads to these new environmental amenities, but through reinvestment and redevelopment that doesn't prioritize residents, you get gentrification and displacement. So in this particular study on Cypress Freeway, I investigated the air pollution and neighborhood impacts of rerouting the Cypress Freeway and constructing a street level boulevard. And so my objectives were to, one, quantify the local effects of rerouting the Cypress Freeway on air pollution by comparing two routing scenarios, and two, to examine the neighborhood's socioeconomic and demographic impacts as reflected by spatial temporal changes and indicators of gentrification to really assess whether existing residents benefit or are excluded due to the phenomenon of environmental gentrification. And so I assessed two routing scenarios. The first is the rebuild in place, which was the rejected plan to just rebuild the damaged Cypress Freeway along the original alignment. And then two, which was the reroute, which was the actual plan, which involves reconstructing the freeway along a different route and replacing the removed section with this landscape boulevard. And so I'm not sure if there's any air pollution related folks in here, but I looked at NOx, nitrogen oxides, and black carbon because West Oakland is heavily trafficked by heavy duty trucks, which are major sources of NOx and black carbon. These are diesel dominated air pollutants. For any of my air pollution enthusiasts, you might be in the crowd. And so what did I do? So the IA-80 reroute was completed in 1998 and Mandela Parkway in 2005. And I estimated concentrations for the year 2009. And this was due to the availability of traffic count data for Mandela Parkway. And so one thing I like about this project and essential to my work even to now is that the only reason that this study was even possible was because of the use of community data. So I'm not sure. And so having this detailed traffic count data from Mandela Parkway are from the West Oakland Truck Survey, which was a community-based participatory research project by the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project. the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, and Sonoma Technologies, Inc. Is anyone here familiar with West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project? Just be instructed. Well, it's a really great organization fighting for environmental justice if anyone is interested in learning more about them. But I digress. So from truck counts, I was able to estimate other vehicle types and hourly counts. And then I combined, for the rebuild in place, I combined the West Oakland Truck Survey along Mandela with Caltrans truck estimate data. And from counts, I could estimate emissions. You might not be interested in this as much, using emission factors. And then from there, I could use a dispersion model to estimate concentrations. And then so I had the pollution side, but then I also wanted to look at the neighborhood change side. And this is the side that really is where I glean a lot of the lessons of how the Cypress case can inform new freeway removal projects. And so to investigate the impacts of freeway rerouting on neighborhood change, I compared 1990 and 2010 demographic, socioeconomic, and housing variables. And so as you see in the table, demographic variables included the percent non-white, percent non-Hispanic Black, percent Hispanic. Socioeconomic variables, percent college, percent poverty, and then housing variables. So let's get to the results. And I'll briefly go through these. And so this first result is looking at the impact of the Cypress rebuild in place and reroute scenarios on NOx concentrations. And so really what it shows is it's just providing quantitative data that substantiates that by rerouting the Cypress Freeway, the high concentrations shift from the residential area into this more, into the periphery, which is the industrially zoned area. And so we see a 38% reduction in annual average NOx concentrations, 25% reduction for black carbon. And again, this just provides quantitative support to show that replacing a freeway with a boulevard does reduce the traffic burden, which results in air quality benefits. And then this is a standard distance decay curve that is very typical within looking at traffic-related air pollution. And so with the freeway, you see this steep decline as you go away. But what it's really showing is, again, this providing this quantitative evidence of how by replacing it with the Mandela Parkway, you greatly decrease the pollutant concentrations for residents who live along the landscape boulevard in comparison to when they lived along the freeway. So let's get into some more looking at neighborhood change. And so this table presents the average change in demographic, socioeconomic, and housing indicators between 1990 and 2010 for all tracts in West Oakland. So comparing all of West Oakland to a 250-meter band along Mandela Parkway to kind of see if there's any differences. And so first, for every indicator suggests gentrification occurred. We have decreases in percent non-white, percent residents living in poverty, percent renter-occupied residents. But it also provides evidence of environmental gentrification along Mandela Parkway. And we see this with a larger decline in the percent of residents living in poverty and a sharper decrease in the Black population compared to West Oakland as a whole. And so reductions in the Black population may be due to increases in the cost of housing. The median home value increased more along Mandela Parkway. In fact, median home values were lower along the Cypress Freeway than in West Oakland, but significantly higher along the Mandela Parkway as compared to West Oakland as a whole. And so these larger property value increases along Mandela Parkway may be due to the freeway rerouting and conversion to the boulevard, which is consistent with some of previous other studies. I'm not sure if you all have read the work of Robert Severo, who was at UC Berkeley, who did a lot of work around this as well. And so one thing that I do want to note is that the area along Mandela Parkway had smaller increases in median rents, which may be due to the presence of affordable housing. I'm not sure how familiar you all are, but there are a lot of affordable housing units. And so this really speaks to the importance of preserving affordable housing to reduce the displacement of intergenerational residents. And this comes up later. So conclusions are that West Oakland residents saw rerouting the Cypress Freeway and replacement with the landscape boulevard as an opportunity to mitigate the air pollution burden that was caused by freeway construction and to increase access to urban green space. And so we see that rerouting did result in these pollution concentration reductions. And additionally, we see though, that it resulted in some environmental gentrification and displacement of longtime Black residents. And so this displacement is facilitated, as I showed in that previous diagram, through these economic revitalization efforts that do not prioritize the needs of the longtime residents. And again, this will come up later. But I intentionally say that freeway rerouting and construction of a landscape boulevard can be a mechanism of environmental gentrification, because what it really comes down to is the presence or absence of equitable policies and practices, such as anti-displacement strategies and affordable housing, that can make the difference and determine equity outcomes. And so this work shows the importance of intersectional policies in order to advance equity and environmental justice, while recognizing the need to center community to ensure that their needs are met. And so this very thing is something that cities and states are grappling with, especially with the infusion of federal funding to reconnect communities. And I'm going to attempt to play a video. We will see.
Everyone, it's Secretary Pete. We are in Birmingham, Alabama today, celebrating the launch of the Reconnecting Communities program. This is the first ever dedicated federal initiative to repair the harm caused by some of the infrastructure choices of the past, and instead replace them or improve them for projects that bring people together. Good transportation helps people move to where they need to be, travel affordably, quickly, and efficiently, connects you to the places you need to be and the people you love. But sometimes America has gotten things wrong in generations past. And then transportation infrastructure can even do the opposite, cutting people off from schools or healthcare, dividing or damaging neighborhoods. But we can do something about that. Thanks to the president's bipartisan infrastructure law, we have funding to make better places that were impacted by the choices of the past. Sometimes that might mean tapping a highway, putting in a park over it where kids can play and people can get across to where they need to be. In other cases, it means something like introducing a bus rapid transit connection from previously isolated neighborhoods, like what they're doing right here in Birmingham that we're celebrating today. What all the different kinds of projects have in common is that they will better connect people to opportunity, to prosperity, and to each other, which is what transportation is all about.
Got to work the importance of testing for a presentation. All right. Oh, nowhere to say that for a second. So I'm partial to that video because I have family in Birmingham, so it's nice to see them being recognized. But the bipartisan infrastructure law, the BIO, invests $1 billion to reconnect communities. And then the Inflation Reduction Act provides an additional $3 billion for neighborhood access and equity grants. Was anyone familiar with the Reconnecting Communities program? Cool. Yeah. I'm excited in a way, but we'll talk about it right now. So before I go into the program, I want to highlight a few things. And so one, just as with environmental justice and the Cypress Freeway example that I discussed, freeway removal was born out of grassroots organizing, not out of the government. And so I'd like to show my last clip, we'll afraid this works too, From Ramps to Nowhere, which is a film about how community activism in Seattle actually led to the successful fight against freeway expansion. Hope we have success again.
More about transportation than people that I talk to in the transportation department.
Over half of all the highway trust funds generated in states throughout the country are generated on city streets. Maybe these highways are a lucrative source of revenue for the state highway department.
The narrow waist of Seattle makes land here so scarce that we cannot permit additional traffic corridors simply to provide for commuters.
What? Not. Uh-oh. Yeah, it's scared. It would connect to like a guest. All right, technical difficulties, but that's okay. I'm gonna use technical engineering, but really you're like, all right, worst case, I can describe it. Best case, we can watch it.
What you can also do is just put the your own chat. Definitely viewers view it on their end. So in Zoom. I'll give you your own.
Okay. So it was a great video, but you know, technical difficulties. So what the video was just showing was this multiracial coalition in Seattle. You had the Socialist Party working with the Black Panthers to actually defeat a freeway. I still have hope as I'm talking. To defeat freeways in Seattle. So Seattle actually had planned to build like 15 highways through this multiracial.
Secretary Pete here, and I want to
Oh
take
my God, now you're talking too. Oh, goodness gracious. And so just showing that through this multiracial coalition, they were able to defeat the freeways. And so really just showing this video to speak to how this idea of freeway removal, freeway fighting is all coming from grassroots organizing. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I am a huge, well, I should say my work is very much inspired by grassroots organizing and recognizing the folks who are on the ground, who build these campaigns and movements to eventually get it to the federal level. You know what, it's sending out today, so we're just gonna go back here. So it's a great video. I don't know if you got a glimpse or heard in like the first 30 seconds as they were talking, but a lot of the arguments that they were making back then still hold today as to why freeways are bad, or how freeways negatively, I shouldn't just say they're bad, that's like, yeah, but just how freeways could negatively impact their community. So let's move on. So the second thing I want to highlight before diving back into the Reconnecting Communities program is that even though it's novel in that it directs federal investments toward freeway removal projects, it's not novel in concept. And so there's already precedent, as there are several completed projects, as you see here, and these images are taken from the Congress for the New Urbanism. Is anyone familiar with that organization? The Congress for the New Urbanism, a few folks, from their webpage. And so there's several projects in Boston's Big Dig, an example is Madrid, Portland's Harvard Drive, you're now San Francisco Embarcadero Freeway. And if you're not familiar with any of these examples, you are now familiar with Mandela Parkway in Oakland. But I do just want to take a moment to highlight the Embarcadero Freeway in San Francisco, which we mentioned very much. And so, has anyone ever been to the Embarcadero in San Francisco? Did anyone know that it used to look like this? Yes. And so, did y'all talk about this in class?
I don't think we used this.
Oh, okay. And so, the Embarcadero Freeway provides an example of a freeway that was torn down without a replacement route. And so I want to highlight this for 3 reasons. 1, to emphasize that this is the goal line for removal. And so we heard Secretary Pete talk about capping, but the goal really is removal. 2, to demonstrate that removal is possible, as we see here. And then 3, the Embarcadero was also torn down after the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. And what had stood there was actually a portion of the originally planned route. And so it was actually supposed to connect the Bay Bridge, which we can see in the background, all the way to the Golden Gate. So if folks are familiar with San Francisco, there was supposed to be this double-decker highway that whole way, which really is a testament to the effective freeway revolts of the 1950s and 1960s in San Francisco. And so the SF Planning Department had actually planned to build 10 freeways throughout San Francisco, but it was halted, and that's why you got that unfinished freeway that abruptly terminated. And then after the Loma Prieta earthquake, it was not rebuilt due to continued advocacy. And look at the benefits of a full removal, right? And then the next thing I want to highlight is that the $1 billion for the Reconnecting Communities program is actually divided into two areas. So you get $250 million for planning grants and $750 million for capital construction grants. And so planning grants provide funding for planning studies, community engagement, and a technical assistance program. And so this actually is not a new idea, but was something that builds off the work of former Secretary Anthony Fox, who really was the first Secretary of Transportation to formally recognize the inequitable racial and economic impacts of freeways. And so it was winners of Anthony Fox's Every Place Counts design challenge. And so that was the secretary under or during the Obama administration. And so winners of his Every Place Counts design challenge received technical assistance for freeway teardown or capping projects. And so again, this work isn't new, but it builds off of things that were already happening. And then the second bucket are the capital construction grants. And so these provide funding for the actual removal, retrofit, or mitigation of infrastructure and the replacement of that infrastructure with things that restore connectivity. It is the Reconnect Communities program. And so to be eligible for that bucket, applicants must have already completed planning studies and activities. So this is an image taken from that same website of recently awarded projects. Just Tuesday was the 20th. So just this past Tuesday, the US DOT announced $185 million in awards for 45 projects seen here. So the six indicated in green are capital construction grants. So again, that's to actually tear down or retrofit freeways, and then 39 were for planning grants. So really these studies to take place to look at what that could look like. And I think it is important to note that the highest proportion of funding went to proposals to cap the freeway. So that was 12 projects, and then about a quarter of the funding went to projects that are looking at actual removing of freeways or other barriers. And again, removal is the goal line. And I do want to highlight that according to America Walks, so that organization did a preliminary analysis of who was funded. So 12 of the planning grants and 3 of the construction grants went to communities that are part of the Freeway Fighters Network. And so this is an image taken from the Freeway Fighters. So again, this speaks to organizing. So these are communities who have been fighting against their freeway infrastructure. And so I will say I do attend Freeway Fighter Network meetings, but it is very interesting to just see a lot of the work, and now it's building this national coalition to say what are best practices in communities that, again, have been adversely impacted by this freeway infrastructure. So let's look at a couple examples. And so this is from Reconnect Rondo, and Reconnect Rondo was awarded $2 million for its planning project called the Rondo Land Bridge and African American Cultural Enterprise District in St. Paul, Minnesota. And so the construction of I-94, which is what they're hoping to build a land bridge over, led to the destruction of over 700 homes and 300 businesses in the Rondo neighborhood. And they actually have conducted an impact study, which found that the loss of those 700 homes alone resulted in $157 million in lost intergenerational wealth. So they're one of the few communities that has actually been able to quantify that lost intergenerational wealth by the destruction of these homes. And so Reconnect Rondo is the grantee, which is a community-based organization, and they are proposing a land bridge, which is a capping project. And so this is just a rendering of that. And then another example is the I-81 project in Syracuse. And so last January, Governor Hochul announced the $32.8 billion state capital plan, which would include $3 billion over 5 years to reconnect communities across New York State. And one of those projects is the construction of the I-81 community grid project in Syracuse. And construction of the I-81 forced the displacement of nearly 1,300 residents from the 15th Ward, which was a historic Black community that housed 75% of the city's Black population. The community grid project will remove a 1.2 mile stretch of I-81 and construct a walkable, bikeable grid of surface streets. And so the city of Syracuse was awarded $500,000 for its Reconnecting, a post-I-81 viaduct planning project. And I named this example because one of the groups that was really instrumental in this effort was Hinge Neighborhoods, Inc., which is a member of the Freeway Fighters Network. And then our final example takes us back to Oakland. So the California Department of Transportation was awarded $680,000 for its planning project called Vision 980 Study Phase 2 Feasibility Study to explore ways to reconnect areas along 980. So if you're familiar with the 980, there's been a lot of work around 980. And so this really just, that's why it's phase 2. It takes it to this next step. And so this is an image of 980. And what we really see is how it tore through and segregated West Oakland, what you see on the left from downtown. And so this image shows Shirley Foster near the Interstate 980. And so the caption reads, in the 1970s, Foster lived in one of the more than 500 homes that were in the path of the interstate construction and was relocated to her current home where she's lived for 41 years. And I show this to take a moment to emphasize that any effort to repair harm, again, this is, they say that the reconnecting communities will really help repair harm, must consider reparations. And so the question is, how can Reconnect communities restore the lost intergenerational wealth? And so I mentioned how many homes were destroyed, how many businesses were destroyed in each of these communities. Here we see that 500 homes were destroyed in order for the I-980. So when we talk about reconnecting communities, it might be good for land and geographically for folks now to be able to have better connectivity. But what about the folks who have lost homes? What about the folks who have since moved, for instance, away completely from Oakland? So how do we repair harm and couple that with reparations for the folks who have lost all of this? So I just add that before finishing with a few key lessons. One, at this moment, there's an opportunity for transportation investments that repair harm by reconnecting communities divided by freeways. However, as the Cypress Freeway case demonstrates, these efforts must include anti-displacement measures to ensure longtime residents benefit. 2, removal is the goal line. And as we saw, it's possible. And this is essential to really ensure that we do not further entrench auto infrastructure another 60 plus years via capping only projects. So I mentioned that the highest proportion went to capping, but capping really just helps further entrench because now you have this cap and we're going to maintain that freeway infrastructure. And so what does it look like to do things that don't further entrench this infrastructure? And then 3, although the Reconnecting Communities program specifically aims to redress historical injustice, as mentioned by Secretary Pete, freeway construction and expansion projects continue today. And it continues to disproportionately displace low-income communities of color. And so as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the reduction and elimination of harm is a requisite for justice. And so justice must be embedded in all transportation policies and decisions. And so we can't just reconnect one community over here, while over here we're going to continue to expand and build new freeways that destroy another. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you. Let's open it up to questions from the room first.
Thank you for your presentation, number one. I have a few questions for you, but I'll only ask one right now. When these highways were built, obviously, I'm sure the government implemented eminent domain. where government seizes private property for the benefit of the public good. However, at least my understanding is, according to current laws, people whose property is appropriated by the government, they're supposed to receive a just or market level compensation for it. To what extent do you know, or have any studies been done that try to, or how do I say it, to what extent do you know like the current level of money people received in compensation for their property being taken by the government? And I assume it was below market value.
Yeah, so historically, some people never saw money that was promised to them. Like you said, the eminent domain, and they were supposed to guarantee housing, but a lot of them didn't. Or that's how we get our new projects and things like that, because that took people and then housed them in these neighborhoods. And so, but yeah, so I'm not sure exact numbers, but a lot of readings do mention how there is a good portion of folks who never actually got money. And then we're seeing today, there's an example in South Carolina where they're doing a freeway expansion and people's homes are being taken, and there's being offered about money at values below the rate. And then in the Seattle example, which I'm so sad did not show, but you get instances even where there's a planned route, and even if they're not built, people are bought out of their homes at below the rate of the value of the home, even though some of those homes are still standing today, but those people were bought out for, again, below the actual value. So you see a lot of problematic push outs historically, and even continues today. And yeah, the South Carolina example was detailed a year ago or so in the Washington Post, a recent example of how planned freeway expansion is going to continue to take land communities.
If I can add context, so so you talked about Secretary Fox in one of the last presentations that he gave around the Equitable program. Shows the displacement and displacement by race, white, and black, really compelling graphic. And you can see a sharp decline in the number of displacements around 1970-71, which is when the Uniform Relocation Act was passed, when they actually had to start compensating families for it. So prior to that, which was led to those ones.
So I guess I have one question related to this, and then I have another question. The first one related to this is to make amends for what's happened, and eventually at the end, like how to actually find the correct value of what has been lost, considering, probably it's been changing in time. So it's not only the house, but maybe the business, whatever they didn't own. And so it's probably very complicated to reach to a reasonable amount to actually compensate for that. And is anybody can quantifying that and how to do that? So that's the first one. And the other one that you kind of mentioned at the beginning is right now, there are doing some implementations or strategies to mitigate the displacement of people when there's a new project that could potentially gentrify the community. So can you tell us more about what those strategies are? Because that's super common, a train or whatever, and you're gonna probably make the land value higher in displacing people. So what can you do for that? So those.
Yeah, so in terms of quantifying the amount owed, the example of the Reconnect Rondo, where they were able to quantify home loss. But in terms of looking at the image, you destroyed homes, you destroyed businesses, you destroyed communities. And so I personally am not familiar with any studies that have fully quantified that amount. And it's interesting because California has the reparations task force right now, but even with that, they're not looking at infrastructural damage in terms of reparations. So there's even a disconnect in how that is looking at reparations to even incorporate the value from this. And so I'm not going to fully quantify that. And so it is interesting though too, that transportation is not really in those reparations task force conversations. Oh, and then in terms of strategies. So like a few just general anti-displacement strategies come to mind. Like one, are there even renter protections that are in an area? Is there affordable housing within the area? And is it actually affordable housing at multiple levels of income, not like Bay Area affordable housing where you qualify, what is it, like $100,000? Like it's insane. So like actual affordable housing at multiple incomes. Let's see what else comes to mind. Those come to mind immediately around renter protections and increase in affordable housing.
What are the air quality impacts of actually capping the freeway? Can that reduce it? Or is it, because some of these examples that you showed, they looked like they were very limited amounts of capping.
And so you're going to get, because of the plume disbursement, so if your freeway is sunken, so that will alleviate some of the plume dispersion to community. Or if, let's see, so you're not going to have here, but you're going to still, when it comes out. So you might not have it in the same vicinity area, but then when it does come out over here, those folks will still be impacted. So you might have these very localized benefits, but they're not going to be overall. And that's the thing with transportation, traffic related air pollution, oh my goodness, with the graph that I showed, like since pollutant concentrations decrease so rapidly away, it's always about, well, not always, but it's really about these localized impacts here. The distance taker. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. And I have two questions. So first one is more related to what Carolina asked about the quantification of the laws. So when we are talking about this 1 billion grant from the infrastructure bill, and you mentioned another 3 billion. How has this amount been arrived at? And do you think it's sufficient considering the losses that have been incurred over all these years? And second question is, you showed the map of these different selected projects which are being used under this Reconnecting communities. So how were those projects selected? What happens in like key criteria to identify these communities need, their concerns need to be addressed first, rather than, I'm sure there are many communities which would, their projects won't be considered.
Yeah, so in terms of the 1 billion and 3 billion, originally Biden, when he first had his whole plan, it was going to be 20 billion, and that got cut to the 1 billion for the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so 1 billion is definitely not enough. The 3 billion that's added from IRAs helps, but it's still not enough. And then we see that by the number of applicants, almost 500 communities applied. And you see that there were only, 45 that were granted. And so there's a lot of interest in this. There's a lot more that needs to be, a lot more funding that needs to happen. And then we even see that in terms of the split between capital construction grants, were only 6 compared to the planning grants. And the capital construction grants are going to need more because you're actually doing the removal or the retrofit. And so if we want to move to that phase, a huge amount of money is going to need to be invested. In terms of considerations, something that was a good thing to see was that they did prioritize like actual capping and removal projects over some state agencies applied, and they would like expand their freeway and then say, but we're going to cap it. And so they tried to apply for funding. So you did see equity come in through there. But in terms of other things that were considered, I'm not exactly sure how they went from 500 to 46. I'm not exactly sure how they narrowed it down, but I do know that they at least had the equity lens in terms of that.
So you showed the map of like which projects were chosen and the freeway fighter organizations. And I was wondering if you know anything about what community engagement processes might have looked like in the pre-proposal stage. Like, did cities work with communities on like site location and proposal design for any of these cities that you know about or could speak to?
Yeah, so I briefly mentioned that there were like 12 of the planning grants and 3 of the capital construction involved communities from the Freeway Fighters Network. And so, so what is that? 15 of the projects did directly have influence from folks who have been part of this movement for a long time. You see places even like Minnesota's Department of Transportation has been doing a rethinking I-94. And then, so Reconnect Rhonda has been part of that process. It's amazing that Reconnect Rhonda got the grant themselves as a community-based organization, but Minnesota has been doing a lot of work around there. And then you see, so they've been having like community meetings regularly, and they've been going on now for over a couple of years now. And so you're seeing that they're meeting regularly, trying to get community input, because you are starting to see that, at least for the transportation agencies that are on board, they really are framing it as we're trying to repair harm. And so they really are trying to come in with this community engaged piece. Another example I'll point to is the Reconnect South Park, which is in Seattle, Washington. And so they are another awardee, and they have been working very closely with Washington's Department of Transportation. And even the state was already considering to give funding for that project. They actually have contracted out before you see funding from the federal government coming in. Similarly with New York State, you see a lot of work happening. So you're seeing places where, because of community organizing, it made it to the state level, and they were already doing these community engaged processes. Michigan, similarly, with their I-375 improvement project, as it's called, which would actually remove the freeway that I showed in the image from Detroit, or a segment of it. And so they are actively engaging too. They were actually hoping to get a capital construction grant, but they didn't. But they have already been in the work. So a lot of these places are already like engaged with their community, because again, this came from grassroots organizing. Yeah, I hope that's it.
There are a couple of questions. I do apologize if this has been answered already. Are there examples of people being financially compensated for the intergenerational wealth lost due to freeway construction?
Not that I'm familiar with. I know the focus that I'm most familiar with is to reconnect the community itself and improve connectivity. But in terms of actually giving people money, I will say though, I'm just confused what city in SoCal this is, but there is a program where they say that they are going to bump people up on the affordable housing list if they were displaced, if their family was displaced from freeway construction. And so,
Santa Monica.
Is that Santa Monica? Yeah. And so that's not a direct compensation, but I am familiar with that policy to try to rectify it from that.
There's one more.
Yeah.
Okay. I've seen the price of delay used as a metric in transportation decisions, with the time of the more affluent valued highly and poorer people's time devalued, resulting in disproportionate transportation impacts and availability. Is everyone's time now being treated equally?
So I think they're asking in Nottingham, where the assumption was higher income folks have a higher value of time. So the question is, are we following that as an equal value?
So the way in which I interpret this is like when we talk about freeway construction and whose time was even valued there, if I'm interpreting correctly. And so then my mind goes to how freeways were constructed for suburbanization and prioritization of white suburban commuters. Is that the line of question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. I can read it again if you'd like.
I don't know.
Okay, that's fine. And that's what we've got so far. I think Prashant raised his hand. I don't know if he's typing in his question, but if it comes up, I'll.
Okay, great.
Yes, if you could go back to slide, I think it was 2 slides before Pete Buttigieg, where you show the changes. That was 2 slides before. Maybe let's go. There we go. Yes, the environmental gentrification. One thing I saw right there that's an interesting figure is both the change in percent renter occupied. So you see the West Oakland part, am I correct? That was where the new freeway was built. Am I correct?
So West Oakland is looking at it as a whole, and then the landscape boulevard is the Mandela. So just looking closer to along Mandela is the 250 meters as compared to West Oakland more broadly. Okay, so West Oakland has nothing to do with the rerouted freeway, am I correct? So the rerouted freeway happened in West Oakland, but one is comparing like demographic and socioeconomic areas for all of West Oakland and then just along the landscape boulevard. Okay.
This is a bit long. I'm just going to go ahead and read it. So thank you for your presentation. Even after the Tulsa race riot in the 1920s, Black Wall Street in the Greenwood neighborhood there continued to thrive, even with continued racial segregation, until it was basically paved over by the interstate highway there in the 1960s, I think. At which point it failed to recover to its previous levels of wealth and wealth generation because the Black middle class followed the white middle class in white flight to the suburbs via the highways. Meanwhile, new regulations and zoning restrictions have increased the barriers to entry for small businesses in many cities. Is simply reversing the existence of the highway, even in conjunction with affordable housing, even for multiple income levels, going to be enough or economically sustainable when aiming to economically uplift communities that have been disadvantaged and displaced by past highway construction?
One, I will note before I actually answer the question, that Tulsa was also a recipient of a Reconnecting Communities grant, which is very interesting and very symbolic given the history of it as Black Wall Street. But in terms of Will Freeways alone plus affordable housing policies, I would say no, and that's the shortcoming. And so that's why getting at that question before I gave the few key points around what does reparations actually look like, one, and then two, what we can do is have those community visions. And so I think a lot of this work is around what does community want and how do we have community policies, intersectional policies to actually rebuild communities. And it begs the question of what is a community, what is a whole community, and what is necessary for a community to thrive, and how do policies of the city in which that community is in support that. So it's going to take a lot more than just transportation policies. It's going to take a lot more than just housing policies, but it will take a lot of economic policies. It will take a lot of just various policies to really say, how are we going to rebuild entire communities? Is the short answer of it. I say this freeway removal is a step because you are reconnecting, especially if you are being led by community visions for what that could look like. But in terms of is that sufficient, it's going to take a lot more to actually increase the economic benefits, I would say. You can bring in, because I know like in the South Park, they want to bring in these different centers, different business opportunities, but even what are the businesses? Those aren't the same business owners who were displaced previously. So again, how do we get to that reparations piece? It's still also a missing question. So short answer, no. Long answer, it's going to take a lot of different policies to really rebuild entire communities.
So I had a question more like on the word reconnect, because the terminology as I feel it's being used here is very much like physically reconnect, but then it's still not going to the actual reconnecting in like social and all the other aspects, because it's very hard to actually bring the people that were displaced to many other places to be again in the area. So like, do you think there's going to be like, and maybe that this is when you were making emphasis on this is like freeway removal thing. It's not really addressing the rest of the connectivity that they could be doing. And then maybe if you could like tell us if you think eventually they're gonna have also like other kinds of budgets that are not just for the physical connection.
Yeah, you bring up a very great point. And so that speaks to that reparations piece, because people were forced out. How do you even locate everybody who was displaced or the descendant of somebody who was displaced? That's an entire project. We have now, again, as an example, the California Reparations Task Force. They're not even looking at who's displaced and impacted by transportation. That's a whole other thing. And so, again, what is community? What does it mean to rebuild entire communities? And it's going to be more than just saying, oh, now I can cross over where there was previously a freeway, or even the program applies to like rail that divided communities. So yes, now I can go across, and for instance, the West Oakland to downtown, now I can get to downtown more easily, but my people are gone. My house was still gone. I'm in an apartment when I used to live in a house. Like, how do we do that? And is there going to be a budget for that? Once the Biden administration is gone, I don't even know if there's going to be a budget for reconnecting communities past what year is 2027. Yeah, so past 2027, there might not be this 1 billion plus 3 billion. So there's a lot more work. That's why I always emphasize grassroots organizing. There's a lot more work. You're seeing states take it on, like Governor Hochul gave $3 billion, which was the entire budget of the Inflation Reduction Act. And that was just New York State. So can we get states to come on board? Can we get cities to come on board? Like Seattle was already behind this Reconnect South part. I feel like it's going to take a push to actually get more money, because we'll see what the federal government does after. We'll see what the election does in 2024. So, yeah.
If I can ask a question. So at most of the projects that I'm familiar with so in the construction of the freeways, you took private property and turned it into public property. And most of the, like the I-81 example that you showed, the Mandela Parkway, the Korean example where they took the freeway out over the river, it remains as the public right of way. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with examples, or what would it take as maybe a reparations scheme to turn that back into public housing or private housing in some way to kind of rebuild rather than destroy?
I will say I like what Washington's law, the number is slipping my mind, but they passed a policy with their like right of way or excess land. It has to go to community and like be for projects that benefit community. I forget the law number. Oh, what? But it's an example of how they're trying to say this land, decisions on this land have to be done with community and benefit community. And so it's going to go to either affordable housing in partnership with community or other community beneficial land uses. I'm forgetting the law number, but that's the only example that comes to mind is how they're trying to say it has to be given back or be decided upon in a community. So I'm forgetting that.
Any other questions?
Is there, well, I have 2 questions actually. The first question is the lost intergenerational wealth. I was I don't know if you can speak a little bit more on like how many, you mentioned that so far there's really only like one like successful like way. Is there any other like organizations or like communities that are trying to do that kind of math, and how is that math? Like how do we do that math? This is maybe kind of a response, I think Tim's question earlier too. We were talking to people who were like, even when we were displaced and we were given like the market value of our homes, they were low priced homes anyway that were raised over. So the money to go move somewhere else that was more expensive anyway, it's not really like that's also a loss of wealth too. So that's kind of my first question, is if you know anything else about that. And then I think you also mentioned in your slides, you were like, oh, I also have some like drawbacks or about like the Reconnecting Communities program too. I know we talked about a lot of them already, but I was curious if you had any more that were still in your mind.
In terms of examples, the only study I'm really familiar with is the Reconnect Rondo, and I'm not. And so that study is publicly available on their website, and so I'm not sure who they partnered with to conduct that study, but the whole study methodologies is on their website, so that can be looked over as an example. In terms of other shortcomings of the Reconnecting, I would say my large ones. I would say one of my biggest is the one I named, in the sense that, like, yes, we're doing this Reconnecting Communities, but then a majority of your budget is to road projects. So, yeah. So that's why I try to emphasize you need justice in all policies. So it's like, yes, this is good, and there will be benefits, but if we need a fundamental shift, and this is, I think, a start, but it doesn't get anywhere near the level. Because again, so we're going to potentially cap or remove over here, but now we're going to be over here in Texas and expand the highway by like 6 lanes and displace more people. And so again, as Dr. MLK Jr. said, and a threat to justice anywhere, the president everywhere, something like that. So yeah, so that was being one of them. The second one is you're connecting the land, but you're not. What are we doing? What is reparations? If you're going to have reparative planning, if you're going to repair harm, we need to actually have a real fundamental conversation about what does reparations mean. And I know a lot of these case studies explore some of the impacts on Black communities who were predominantly impacted. But I mean, mentioned at lunch, Boyle Heights, they were impacted. Like, there's so many communities that were impacted. And so it's just like having the budget to do this work, there's just so many things. But I think it's a very important start. One is the importance of grassroots organizing to even have this national conversation. Like, the fact that the federal government is even acknowledging the impact that road projects have on adverse impact is very important. To actually allocate money is very important. So I think it is a start, but there's just a lot more work to be done.
Well, I think that's work that you all will be involved in doing. So I think that's well work. And we'll end for today. Please join me and our speaker another.